told me, I think we may just be seeing the tip of the iceberg, and there may be many more cases in the months and years to come as we become more sensitized to the problem.
If fraud is committed, the perpetrator now faces a unique breed of investigator, a kind of police force known as the ORI, or the Office of Research Integrity. Dr. Richard Broadwell is a neuroscientist. Like others in the ORI, he's willing to suffer the consequences of challenging the work of other scientific colleagues.
Being an ORI investigator necessarily means that there are going to be times when you're not liked, not appreciated for what we're supposed to do. But I'm a scientist, and I view science as a very serious business. We have to protect researchers who are very honest and reputable and reliable. And not all of the data that are published are reliable or accurate.
These fraud investigators may not look formidable, but the ORI's investigations record is impressive. 200 cases of alleged fraud in just 2 years.
I mean, they not only worked there, but the salary was paid, and they were visiting scientists.
Okay. I called the group together to talk about a new case, but I wanted to wait till Richard gets here before we really begin. Andy's here. Welcome, Richard. I understand that we have...
Richard Broadwell has received an official allegation against a fellow scientist who claims to have discovered a new human protein. Suspicions were first raised when a member of the scientist research group found questionable data. He contacted the ORI team.
Were you able to get comparison evidence as well as the question material?
We sequestered all of the individuals' notebooks and laboratory records. We do have comparison.
The legal powers of these investigators are considerable and would be inconceivable in Britain.
We'll have to develop a memo to bring the Secret Service in if we're going to need their forensic capabilities, as it sounds like we do need in this case.
Each of these scientists has a different area of expertise. Their skills are pooled whenever a new case is investigated.
Analysis of the data.
The scientist who's under suspicion was forced to hand over all his raw data. It included his statistical analysis. Investigators took a close look at his figures.
The question data showed a clear preference for certain favorite digits typical of that particular individual on that particular day as that individual was making up these numbers. The unquestioned data showed a uniform distribution of the same comparable digits which showed no preference whatsoever.
The figure that the scientist produced from his graph...
The most damning evidence came when they used computer technology to compare two sets of experiments.
He's discovered a new protein on these human cells.
The scientist used a color stain and gel to show a separation of proteins. One set was supposed to be from rats and the other from human tissue.
The scientist claims to have identified his protein P48 from these cells. These are the gels that represent this experiment, and what you can see is that they're labeled actually rat. We think there's something strange here. Now, when I digitize these gels with the computer, and I digitize the Xerox figure and remove the Xeroxing artifact, we can compare these figures directly and overlay them. And what you see is extremely good correlation for the corners of these two Western blots that would never line up otherwise if they weren't the same experiment on the gel. Now, what's interesting is what's missing in this comparison. There's no red down here. In other words, the scientist used the same experiment, but what he did was he cut out this region. So we think this represents the scientist had falsified his results. So if, in fact, we can show, and I think we can, that, in fact, the Xerox is from the gels, then the scientist has to be lying that he, in fact, discovered a new protein and that he really did discover that he did the experiments on humans at all.
Have a seat. We're going to put you through a cross-examination like we think you're going to see in court.
Once Dr. Broadwell amasses enough evidence, his legal department need to prepare him for his day in court when lawyers representing the accused will try to undermine his evidence.
That's what he's going to try to do now.
One of the big challenges for this office is to bring together the legal and the scientific cultures and the legal standards and the scientific standards. We have to make sure that our cases will stand up in a legal analysis and in a courtroom setting where the rules of evidence are spelled out and where the standards for proving intent are laid out very explicitly. And that's been the biggest challenge, and I think one of the most unique features of this office is this melding of the legal and the scientific cultures.
Dr. Broadwell, you're not an expert in performing or conducting or interpreting Western blots, are you?
No, I'm not.
So by looking at this gel here, you can't tell that it's falsified or fabricated on its face, now can you?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, can you tell by simply looking at the gel whether it contains rat cells or human cells?
No.
Well, then how can you determine that the respondent in this case committed scientific misconduct?
Answer.
When we compare rat gels to human gels, there's a distinct difference.
The most severe action we take is what we call debarment, and that means a scientist is prohibited from receiving federal funds for a specified period of time, anywhere from 3 to 10 years.
But the United States isn't the only country to take action. Denmark, Finland and Norway are all countries which have introduced independent investigating authorities to supervise the published work of their medical and scientific communities. As one of the smallest countries in Europe, Denmark has a tiny science budget. But the threat of scientific fraud is still taken seriously. Unlike Britain, whistleblowers in Denmark are encouraged to speak out. Taxpayers here accept the need for extra money to be set aside to investigate fraud in science and medicine. The initiative came from the scientific community itself. Under the scrutiny of the media, Denmark's Committee of Inquiry has dealt with 21 cases in 2 years. Small specialist teams of experts are hand-picked from all over Europe and North America to examine each case as it arises.
It's a national system, it's independent, it represents universities, hospital owners, scientific societies, all sectors of the scientific community. And it has a High Court judge as a chairman. Everyone can address us as a so-called whistleblower, and we decide if we take up the case.
This hearing concerns allegations against one of Copenhagen's best-known scientists. Dr. Peter Abbey was charged with needlessly placing the lives of African babies at risk in a measles vaccination trial.
Measles is the major killer of children in developing countries. It has been calculated that around 2 million children die every year just from measles infection. These pictures are from a funeral in Guinea-Bissau in West Africa, where we originally started our immunization work against measles.
Dr. Abbey worked in Guinea-Bissau for the World Health Organization. He was testing a measles vaccine when a number of unexplained infant deaths occurred. Abbey was accused of pressing ahead with the vaccine program despite the deaths and of providing the WHO with misleading evidence, a charge he adamantly denies.
I was suspicious of this new vaccine, and I conducted the studies to show that the new vaccine was dangerous. But at that time, the vaccine was used routinely, and it was a question of when could we say that we had sufficient evidence to say that this vaccination should be stopped. We certainly did not use the vaccine for mass campaigns. There were no purpose in doing this.
Peter Abbey and his family had to wait 10 months before the results of the independent inquiry were announced. The committee finally exonerated him and his reputation was restored. As it turned out, he had nothing to fear from Denmark's Committee of Inquiry.
I think Britain needs a system, an independent national system to control and prevent
fraud. Otherwise, I think scientists and others delude themselves. It's always difficult to give advice to a country outside your own, but sometimes it's necessary. So I dare say so.
Back in Britain, our lack of an investigating authority may cast a doubt on this country's scientific and medical reputation overseas. In the meantime, what of Dr. Salim? We finally managed to meet up with him. He's recently returned from Malaysia. We asked him about his most recent research projects.
I've done a lot of work on the role of self-hydrol-containing agents in the treatment of gastrointestinal disorders, skin diseases. I also looked at the role of oxygen-derived free radicals in the development and perpetuation of a number of diseases like gastrointestinal disorders, cancer, and skin diseases.
We invited Dr. Salim to answer some of the questions raised about his work. He admitted there had been some typing errors, but denied he'd ever falsely claimed to have conducted research work in Scotland.
I think you have made a mistake there. That work was published in Archives of Surgery. It was carried out in Baghdad, and I acknowledge no John Blair and attributed no work whatsoever to Perth Royal Infirmary. I think that is a mistake.
He expressed disbelief that a London doctor should describe his surgical procedure as medieval and lethal.
And that comes as a shock and a surprise. They may say that, and I would like to see the evidence that it does. I do not need to resort to improprieties to build an image or to make personal gains. I think what I can confess to you is that I have made losses as a result of wanting to serve mankind, as a result of trying to apply my knowledge in the hope that it would advance science.
It is a science. Members of Britain's scientific community remain undecided about what action, if any, should be taken, and by whom.
Yes, I'm not convinced that this is really a job for the country's Academy of Science. I would, I think, prefer the institutions that already exist, who should be exercising these functions, just to tighten it up to the extent that they haven't got it tight already.
Doesn't this miss the point slightly? The fact is it exists, and we need to have ways of dealing with it.
I agree. Fraud is almost inseparable from the abuse of power. We need a place for people who detect fraud to go to. Until we have that, we have no idea how important the problem is, and I think even the people here, like Michael Baum and myself, who have seen some, will be surprised.
Quite certain that if you set up an institution which encourages complaints, you will encourage complaints. Yes. How many of them in the long run will turn out, A, to be justified, and B, to be significant, only experience will show.
Britain spends about £7 billion on scientific and medical research every year. If the public grows anxious that fraud will not be independently investigated, then the profession's future reputation is at stake.
I visit Great Britain a great deal for collaborative projects with colleagues at institutions within the UK, and I ask my colleagues if they're aware of scientific misconduct. And virtually everyone says, we don't have scientific misconduct here in the UK. I just have to smile and say, you don't know what you have.
I think once the public realizes that fraud is going on, and our MPs realize that fraud is going on, that taxpayers' money is being wasted, valuable research funds that could be used for really vital research is being wasted, then they will insist that something is done.
The public image of research scientists are that they are people with lofty ideals, toiling away selflessly